Ground bait choice for edge fishing, for me it's very simple. What I'm looking for is the ground bait that I can find that's the richest in fish meal, high oils, halibut pellet type based ground baits that are really rich and fish attracting. So my choices are either chunky fish or 50-50 method and paste green. Chunky fish I've been using all summer as well as 50-50. Some days I've mixed them together, some days I've just used them neat. So for today's choice I've gone with a 50-50. We're going to mix it up in a bit and I'll show you a slightly different way of doing that. But when it comes to ground bait and edge fishing, you want the richest you can find. It's definitely the best attractor. We're going to mix the ground bait now. Now I have a bit of a different way of mixing my ground bait for when I'm fishing down the edge, and the emphasis on is that you want it as wet as possible, virtually on the edge of stodge. So what I tend to do is I take my bag, and I think today we're only going to need a little bit. So I'd say about 1/3 of a bag. So just get it like that. Measure your 1/3 of a bag into your bucket. Now you can either use a drill or do it by hand, and I usually use a drill, but for today I'm going to do it by hand. And what we're going to do is we're going to mix it by just flooding it with water, almost like mixing paste. So what we're going to do is we're going to tip that in like that and stir it up. So as you can see there, straight away, right, it is a proper slop, and most people would think that that is ruined. And I reckon within a minute that'll be hardened up. I mean, look at it now already. It's gone from what was runny to, like, you know, it's soaking the water up ever so quick. So what I tend to do is I'll leave it in the bucket like that while I'm getting the rest of my gear set up, and I'll come back to it, and it tends to set like a bit of a cake. So all I do then is get my hand in it, turn it over, rub it up, and it usually goes into a nice fluffy ground bait. And you want it, if in doubt, you can put a little bit more water with it, but you want it so it's just on the verge of going to a stodge. So we'll leave that for a minute or two and come back to it. So this is the ground bait now. You can see it's gone into a proper ground bait. Now you can either riddle it or you can just rub it through your hands. I tend to just rub it through my hands. It literally, you know, when we're preparing the ground bait, it literally only takes seconds. We flood it with water, we stir it up as a slop, and we leave it. And it sets like a bit of a cake. Come back to it in 5-10 minutes time, and you can just rub it through your hands, put it in your bait tub, and you're ready to go. It doesn't need to be too fine for fishing down the edge, because like I say, the finer it is, the easier the fish find it to waft down the edge. So virtually on the edge of stodge is perfect. If anything, a little bit more water rather than a little bit less. So on today's venue, we're fishing for big carp in a very shallow margin. So hence the use for ground bait. Ground bait's usually good for up to about 2 foot. Any more than that, and you've got to think very carefully, because as I've said, the fish just wafting it around. So with big carp in mind, my rig is set up accordingly. I've got a 19 elastic, because they're very big fish in here and they're known to steam off. I've got a nice short stubby float with a thick tip, and the shotting's very simple. I've just got a bulk of 6 number 8 stots and a 4-inch hook length. The hook length is 4 inch, so I can get the bulk very close to the bait, and it's such a heavy float so that the fish don't waft it about, because with it being so shallow they'll come into the edge and they'll waft all the bait around. So we're trying to keep the float as still as possible. It's also important to have a short lash between the pole tip and the end of the elastic, so you can control your float and hold it tight to the edge. With a longer lash it's a little bit more harder to control. And the last thing is, I've got a reasonably sized big strong hook for catching these big fish. For F1s you could step your gear down a little bit and feed little and often, which is what F1s tend to prefer, whereas big carp, we're using the big pot today and we're just topping it up as we go along. And the emphasis on today is thinking about how much to feed and when to feed it, when to top up and how much particles, how much ground bait. And it all depends on the reaction of the fish. Sometimes you don't see any signs of fish in your peg and you need to put a bit more bait in than what you think to get them back there, or sometimes they're there all the time but they just need a little bit to top it up and keep them grubbing around. So it's all about judging how the fish are reacting to how you're feeding it. Now typically I'd say around 3/4 to a full pot full of bait is usually about right at the start of your session, be that about halfway through your match or even at the start if you think it's going to be a really good day. So about 3/4 of a pot of ground bait, a good palm full of micros, and just a pinch of about 20 or a dozen grains of corn. Ship it out nice and steady, and the emphasis is to make sure you're accurate and you get it in exactly the right spot for where you want to feed it. So nice and steady, and remember, tight to the bank. Keep those fish grubbing around for the bait. So very carefully cup it in. Now as the session progresses, you need to think very carefully how much you feed when it comes to topping up. Like a lot of fishing, topping up is most important. Now what I'd say is we're just looking to get 4 or 5 fish into the peg at a time, not too many. So if you put too much bait in, you can get too much commotion into your peg and attract too many fish. What happens is they become very hard to catch because there's too many there and they just waft the bait and spread it all over the place. So my advice would be to feel your way into it, and remember, little is better than more. So a little and often approach. So when it comes to topping up, I'll be just thinking just a little bit of ground bait, a few pellets, and maybe 10 grains of corn. That's all you need. That's enough to attract 3 or 4 fish back into your peg. If you go back in with a big pot full, trust me, you can end up in lots of trouble. So that's how much I'd feed when it comes to topping up. So we'll leave that there and we'll crack on with the fishing. Right, so we've baited up with a nice grain of corn, got a nice short lash on. I'm just going to go back in again. We've had a couple. Feeding now is little and often, 1/3 of a pot, a little bit of ground bait, palm of micros, and about 10 grains of corn. It's important to place your rigging very carefully, as tight to the bank as you can get it, where it's comfortable, where you've plumbed up, and hold it on a tight line if you can, short lash, and just be patient. You're likely to get swirls all over your peg when you get a few fish come in, especially when it's really shallow, but it's about being patient and not chasing them and waiting for the fish to come to you and to give you a positive dink straight under on the float. And sometimes you know that there's a fish there because you can see his tail pattern or signs of him, and it's about being stealthy. And there's a sign of a fish there now. It's probably about 18 inches past my float, but I'm just going to keep my rig where it is. I know it's positioned well. Just keep holding it tight. And wait for the fish to find the bait. When they're feeding confidently, you can go in and catch them dead quick, a bit like that. And when some days you've got to be really patient. They are big fish in here and they run a lot, and you do need to fish heavy. Last week I had one 15.5 pound in a match, and trust me, it took some getting out. So with heavy gear, providing you're patient and you take your time, you usually get them. You foul up the odd fish, there's nothing you can do about that. Everybody foul ups them every now and again, and a lot of it that depends on how the fish are feeding. But if you're patient, nice and steady, ship back, use the roller puller and just ease them in. They're big fish, so you don't need many to put a good weight together. There we go. He's just a little one by today's standards, but he's a decent carp all the same. Proving a bit problematic. Got the hook out. He's just a small one, nice little carp. He's a bit lively, so we'll pop him back in the net. So another great day's fishing, Manor Farm Leisure. Hopefully you've learnt a few tips how to feed your ground bait and your edges. See you on the bank sometime.